The sanctuary was quiet at night. Most of the staff had gone home hours ago. The great stone halls were empty, the torches turned low, and the only sound was the soft scrape of a mop moving slowly across the floor. Tom did not mind the quiet. He had worked the night shift at the Greyvale Sanctuary for 11 years. He knew every hallway, every corner, every draft that came in under the old east door. He knew which torches flickered too fast and which steps creaked near the north stairwell. He knew this building the way some people know an old friend. He was a small man, not young anymore, with calloused hands and a habit of humming softly to himself when he worked. He wore the same gray uniform he always wore, carried the same bucket, and moved at the same slow and steady pace through the lower halls every single night. It was a simple life. Tom had never wanted anything more than that. He was halfway through the east corridor when he heard it. He stopped. It was not a loud sound. It was small, actually. Thin and broken, like something trying very hard to hold itself together and failing. It came from somewhere ahead, low and muffled, as if it was passing through stone. Tom stood still and listened. He thought at first it might be pipes. The old sanctuary had bad pipes in the lower levels. They made strange sounds sometimes, especially in the cold months. But then he heard it again. It was not pipes. There was something almost like a voice in it. Something that rose and fell the way crying did. Not human crying, but crying all the same. Tom picked up his bucket and walked toward the sound. It led him to the end of the east corridor, to a heavy wooden door that was usually kept shut. It was a storage hall, mostly used for old furniture and supply crates that nobody needed anymore. Tom had cleaned in there a few times over the years. There was nothing special about it, but the sound was definitely coming from behind that door. He set his bucket down. He put his hand on the old iron handle. He paused for just a moment, not because he was afraid, but because he was the kind of man who paused before opening doors that were not his to open. Then the sound came again, sharper this time, more broken, and Tom opened the door. The room was dark. He held up his small hand lantern and looked inside. There were 3 of them. They were tucked into the far corner of the room, pressed so close together that at first Tom thought they were one creature. Small and scaled, each one about the size of a large dog, with folded wings held tight against their bodies and tails curled around each other. Their scales were a dull gray-green in the low light. Their eyes were closed. Their sides were shaking. Tom had seen young drakes before. Not often, but enough to know what they were. Dragon young, weeks or maybe a few months old. Far too small to be without their mother. They were crying. Not loudly. It was that same thin, broken sound he had heard in the corridor. Each one made it slightly differently. One made a high sound that kept cutting off like it kept trying to stop and could not. Another made a low, slow sound, steady and exhausted, as if it had been crying for a very long time. The smallest one barely made any sound at all, just a faint trembling breath that was somehow worse than the others. Tom stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at them. He was a cleaner. He was not a dragon handler. He was not a sanctuary official or a healer or anyone with any training for something like this. He did not know the first thing about young drakes beyond the fact that they existed. He looked back down the corridor. Empty. Quiet. Nobody else was coming. He looked back at the 3 small creatures shaking in the corner. Then he walked into the room, set his lantern gently on a nearby crate so the light was soft and not too bright, and lowered himself slowly to the cold stone floor. His knees complained, the way they always did these days, but he settled himself down and sat with his back against the wall, close enough that they would know he was there, far enough that he was not crowding them. He did not speak. He did not reach out to touch them. He did not make any sudden movements. He just sat. One of them, the boldest one, opened its eyes. They were a pale amber color, red around the edges from crying. It looked at Tom with the wide, exhausted look of something that had been frightened for a very long time. Tom looked back at it calmly. He kept his hands still in his lap. He kept his breathing slow. The drake watched him for a long moment. Then it made that thin broken sound again and tucked its head back down. But it did not move away. Tom reached back behind him and pulled a folded cloth from his cleaning belt, the kind he used for drying floors, thick and soft. He spread it out slowly on the ground in front of them, not touching them, just making it available. Something warmer than cold stone. Then he settled back against the wall. The smallest drake was still trembling. Tom began to hum. Very quietly. An old song, one his mother had hummed when he was small and could not sleep. He did not even think about it. It was just the thing that came. The trembling slowed just a little. Tom stayed where he was. Nobody was coming tonight, and these 3 small things were not going to be alone in the dark. Not while he was here. Tom did not leave when the morning light started to come through the small high window of the storage hall. He had sat on that cold floor the whole night. His back ached. His legs had gone stiff somewhere around the third hour. He had dozed off once, briefly, with his chin dropping to his chest, and when he woke the three drakes had shifted slightly closer to him without seeming to realize they had done it. That felt like something. By the time the sanctuary began to wake up around him, sounds drifting in from the upper halls, footsteps, voices, the clatter of the morning kitchen, Tom had not moved. The three drakes were finally asleep. Properly asleep, not that thin restless trembling from the night before. The boldest one, the amber-eyed one, was pressed against Tom's left side. The quiet one was curled a little apart but close. The smallest one, the one who had barely made any sound at all, was asleep on the folded cloth Tom had spread out, with one tiny wing draped over it like a blanket. Tom watched them sleep and did not move. It was another hour before he heard footsteps stop outside the door. The door opened and a young sanctuary worker looked in, saw Tom sitting on the floor surrounded by three sleeping drakes, and went completely still. Tom put one finger to his lips. The young worker nodded slowly, backed out of the room and closed the door very carefully behind him. 20 minutes later the door opened again, this time much more slowly, and Elder Marin stepped inside. She was an old woman, small and sharp-eyed, with white hair pinned back tightly and the kind of expression that suggested she had seen most things in her long life and was rarely surprised by any of them. She was one of the few people at the sanctuary who could read Draconic script. Tom had spoken to her maybe a dozen times in 11 years, usually when she needed a hall cleaned before some important meeting. She looked at the three drakes. She looked at Tom. She looked at the piece of parchment pinned to the wall above the crates that Tom had noticed the night before but could not read. She crossed the room quietly and read it. Tom watched her face. It did not change much. But something in her eyes shifted. She read it twice, slowly, then turned and looked at the drakes again with an expression that was harder to name. She came and lowered herself carefully onto a crate near Tom, close enough to speak in a low voice without waking the young ones. "How long have you been sitting here?" she asked. "All night," Tom said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and looked back at the note. "The note is from their mother," she said quietly. "Her name is Sirith. She was called away 3 days ago. An urgent matter, it says, something she could not refuse and could not delay. She expected to be back within a day." Elder Marin paused. "She has not come back." Tom looked at the three sleeping drakes. 3 days. They had been alone in here for 3 days before he had even heard them. "Is she coming?" he asked. "The note does not say when. Only that she had to go and that she was sorry." Elder Marin folded her hands in her lap. "I have already sent word to the Dragon Council this morning. They have people who handle situations like this. But they are 2 days away at the earliest. Mountain roads." Tom nodded slowly. "And until then?" he asked. Elder Marin was quiet for a moment. "Young drakes cannot regulate their own body heat well at this age. They need warmth, contact, and regular food. They are not in danger yet, but another 2 days alone and they would begin to weaken." She looked at Tom with those sharp eyes. "They should not be left alone." Tom looked down at the amber-eyed drake pressed against his side. It made a small sound in its sleep, something low and soft, and shifted slightly closer to him without waking. "Then I will stay," Tom said. Elder Marin looked at him. "You have a shift. You have a job." "I will stay," Tom said again, just as simply as the first time. Elder Marin was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the three drakes. She looked at Tom. She looked at the way the smallest one was curled on that folded cleaning cloth with its little wings spread out over it. "You understand," she said carefully, "that Sirith is not a small dragon. When she returns, and she will return, she will want to know who was with her young. A dragon mother asking that question is not a small thing." "That is fine," Tom said. "You are not afraid of that?" Tom thought about it honestly. "I am a little afraid of it," he said. "But that does not change anything." Elder Marin looked at him for another long moment. Then something in her sharp face softened, just slightly, the way old stone softens at the edges after enough years of weather. She stood up slowly, smoothing her robe. "I will have the kitchen send food down. I will tell them what young drakes can eat." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "And I will bring you a proper chair, Tom. That floor is no good for a man your age." Tom almost smiled. "I would not say no to that." She left. The door closed softly behind her. The three drakes slept on, warm and quiet, pressed close to a human cleaner who had nowhere else he needed to be. Outside, the mountain roads were long. 2 days was 2 days. Tom settled against the wall and stayed. The chair Elder Marin sent down was old and wooden and wobbled slightly on one leg, but it was better than the floor. Tom set it near the middle of the room, not too close to the corner where the drakes had spent the night, not too far either. He had learned already that distance mattered with them. Too close and the quiet one tensed up. Too far and the smallest one made that faint trembling sound again. There was a right distance, and Tom had found it somewhere in the long hours of the night. He was getting better at reading them. The kitchen had sent down a covered pot of thick meat broth, a wrapped bundle of dried strips of something the kitchen elder called river flesh, and a small crate of what looked like dark dense biscuits made from grain and fat. There was a note with it in Elder Marin's handwriting that said simply, "Warm food first, dry food after, not too much at once." Tom read it twice, nodded to himself and got to work. He poured some of the broth into a wide shallow bowl he had found among the storage crates and set it on the floor a few feet from the drakes. Then he sat back in his chair and waited. Nothing happened for a while. The three drakes watched the bowl. They watched Tom. They watched the bowl again. Then the bold one moved. Tom had started thinking of it as the bold one because it was always the first. First to open its eyes the night before, first to shift closer, first to do anything. It was slightly larger than the other two, with scales that had a faint copper tint at the edges when the light caught them right. It moved toward the bowl in a low careful walk, head stretched forward, eyes flicking between the food and Tom. Tom did not move. He kept his hands loose in his lap and his face calm. The bold one reached the bowl and sniffed it for a long time. Then it drank. Slowly at first, then faster. Tom watched it and felt something in his chest settle. The quiet one came next. It was more hesitant, stopping twice on the way, but it reached the bowl and drank steadily once it got there. It had darker scales than the bold one, almost a blue-gray, and it moved carefully, like it was always thinking before it did anything. The smallest one did not come. It stayed in the corner and watched with wide pale eyes. Tom got up slowly, filled a second smaller bowl and placed it closer to the corner, nearer to where it sat. Then he went back to his chair. It took a long time. But eventually the smallest one crept forward, inch by inch, and drank from the closer bowl with quick nervous sips, eyes up and watching the whole time. Tom said nothing. He just watched and kept his face easy and open. After they had eaten he talked to them. He knew they could not understand him. Young drakes at this age had not learned any common tongue, and even older dragons needed years of exposure before speech meant much. But Elder Marin had told him that morning that the sound of a calm voice mattered more than the words. That young drakes read tone the way other creatures read expression. So Tom talked. He told them about the sanctuary. About the east corridor and the bad pipes and the step near the north stairwell that creaked if you hit it wrong. He told them about the time he had found a family of birds nesting in the supply closet on the second floor and had cleaned around them for 3 weeks without telling anyone because he had not wanted them disturbed. He told them about the winter 2 years ago when the heating system failed and he had spent 4 nights keeping the lower halls warm with portable braziers, one hall at a time, just walking slow circuits all night long. He talked the way he worked. Steadily, quietly, without rushing. The bold one listened with its head tilted slightly. At some point it got up, walked over to Tom's chair, and nudged his hand with its snout. Just once, firmly, the way a dog might. Tom turned his hand over slowly and let it sniff his palm. It did, thoroughly, then went back and lay down again as if that matter was now settled. Tom smiled a little. He decided to call it Ven, the name from the outline Elder Marin had mentioned when describing what the note said about the hatchlings. Ven, Kale and Liss. He tried the names out loud, once each, gesturing slightly toward each drake as he said it. Ven's ears moved when Tom said Ven. Kale, the quiet blue-gray one, blinked slowly. Liss, the smallest, pulled back slightly, then stopped, then stayed where she was. Good enough. The afternoon passed slowly and Tom did not mind. He brought out the blankets that had been sent with the supplies, thick rough ones from the linen stores, and laid them out on the floor in the corner. Ven immediately climbed onto one and turned in a circle 3 times before lying down. Kale took the edge of another and pulled it slightly with his teeth until it was arranged the way he wanted. Liss looked at the third blanket from a distance for a long time. By evening she was on it. And by evening she was not just on it. She had crept, gradually, over the course of an hour, closer and closer to Tom's chair until she was pressed against his leg with her eyes half closed and her small sides rising and falling slowly. Tom did not move. He barely breathed. He just sat there with a tiny drake asleep against his leg and the other 2 settled nearby and the storage hall quiet and warm around them. When the light from the high window went dark and the room filled with the blue of night, Tom began to hum. The same old song from the night before. Slow and low and steady. Ven's head went down. Kale closed his eyes. Liss made one small soft sound and was still. And that night, for the first time since their mother had left them alone in the dark, There was no crying. Just the hum of an old song and 3 small drakes breathing slowly in the quiet. Tom was asleep in his chair when Sirith arrived. He did not hear her coming. Nobody in the lower halls heard her coming until it was already happening. There was a sound like wind being pushed hard through a narrow space, a deep vibration in the stone walls, and then a crash that was not a crash but the sound of something very large moving very fast through a corridor that was not quite wide enough for it. Elder Marin heard it from her office on the 2nd floor and was already moving. 2 sanctuary workers in the main hall pressed themselves against the wall as a massive shape swept past them, scales scraping the stone ceiling, tail swinging wide. She was not being careless. She simply had no room in her mind right now for anything except the door at the end of the east corridor. Sirith was enormous. She was the deep green-black of forest shadow, with scales that caught light the way still water does, in shifting patterns that moved when she moved. Her eyes were amber, the same amber as Ven's but older, and right now they were wide and dark with something close to terror. She had been flying for 2 days straight. Her wings were heavy. There was dust from the collapsed mountain pass still caught in the ridges of her neck. She had left her children alone and she did not know what she would find. She hit the storage hall door too hard and it came off one hinge. The room exploded with movement. Ven shot upright with a sharp cry. Kale scrambled back into the corner. Liz made a sound like a kettle and pressed herself flat to the floor. Tom woke up so fast he nearly fell off his chair, grabbing the armrest with both hands, blinking hard in the sudden noise and the rush of cold air from the broken door. For one moment everything was chaos. Then Sirith saw them. She went completely still in the doorway. Her 3 hatchlings were here. They were awake and startled but they were here, they were whole, their scales had color and their eyes were bright and there was no injury, no sickness, no sign of the slow cold that took young drakes when they were left without warmth too long. They were here. Ven recovered first, the way Ven always did. He made a sound Tom had not heard before, something high and sharp and urgent, and ran straight at his mother with his small legs moving as fast as they could go. Sirith lowered her great head instantly, and Ven crashed into her snout and made that sound again over and over, pressing his whole small body against her face. Kale followed. Slower, more careful, but he came, pressing close against his mother's jaw and going still there with his eyes closed. Liz was last. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, shaking, and then she ran and pushed herself under her mother's chin and did not move. Sirith made a sound so low it was more felt than heard. It moved through the floor and up through the walls and Tom felt it in his chest like a second heartbeat. She curved her long neck around all 3 of them and held them there. Tom sat in his wobbling chair and watched. He felt no need to say anything. This was not his moment. He folded his hands in his lap and gave them the room. It was a long time before Sirith raised her head. When she did she looked at Tom. He met her eyes. Amber and ancient and still wet at the edges in a way he pretended not to notice. He knew that dragons had complicated feelings about being seen in vulnerable moments. He kept his face calm and neutral and let her look. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the blankets on the floor. She looked at the empty food bowls near the wall. She looked at the old cleaning cloth, still folded neatly in the corner where Liz had slept the first night. She looked at the wobbling wooden chair that someone had brought down here and left in the middle of the room, worn smooth on the armrests. She looked back at Tom. He could see her trying to put something together. Trying to understand what she was seeing. A human cleaner. A night shift worker in a gray uniform with calloused hands and an old face. Sitting alone in a storage hall with her children, who were warm and fed and calm. They ate well, Tom said. All 3 of them. Ven took to the broth straight away. Kale took a little longer but he ate well once he got going. Liz was nervous the first day but she was eating fine by yesterday. He said it simply, the way he might report to a supervisor about a job done. Sirith stared at him. Tom waited. She lowered her head. Not a little. All the way. She brought her great head down slowly until her chin was resting on the cold stone floor and her eyes were level with Tom's, close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off her scales. She stayed there. She did not speak. Tom did not know if she could speak in common tongue or if she simply had no words for what she was feeling right now. Either way she said nothing. But she did not look away. Tom looked back at her steadily. He did not feel afraid. He felt, if anything, very tired in the comfortable way a person feels after finishing something that needed doing. Liz made a soft sound under her mother's chin. Ven was already asleep against his mother's neck. Kale had his eyes closed. Tom looked at the 3 of them, warm and still and together again, and felt something quiet move through him. He reached down and picked up his mop from where it leaned against the wall. The storage hall still needed cleaning. 3 weeks passed and the sanctuary went back to normal. The storage hall was cleaned properly, the broken door was fixed, and the blankets were returned to the linen stores. The wooden chair went back to wherever Elder Marin had found it. The food bowls were washed and put away. Everything went back to where it belonged, and the east corridor was quiet again, and Tom's night shift continued the way it always had. He mopped the floors. He checked the torches. He listened to the pipes. He hummed to himself in the dark, empty halls and did not think too much about anything. People asked him about it at first. The other sanctuary workers, the kitchen staff, a few of the daytime cleaners who had heard the story from the young worker who had found Tom sitting on the floor that first morning. They asked what the Drakes were like up close, whether he had been frightened, whether Sirith had said anything to him when she came back. Tom answered the same way every time. He said the young ones were fine, he said he had not really been frightened, and he said Sirith had not said much. Then he changed the subject or went back to work, and after a while people stopped asking. That was how Tom preferred things. The only person who brought it up in a way he did not mind was Elder Marin. She stopped him in the corridor one evening about a week after everything had settled and told him quietly that word had come from the Dragon Council. Sirith had filed a formal account of what had happened. The council had noted it. Elder Marin said this in a tone that suggested it meant something significant without explaining what, and Tom nodded and said he was glad everything had worked out, and she looked at him for a moment with that softened expression she had worn in the storage hall and then let him go. Life continued. Then, on a gray morning near the end of the month, something happened. Tom was in the west corridor running a dry cloth along the window ledges when he heard a commotion from the direction of the servants' entrance. Not a loud commotion. More like the sound of several people going very quiet and very still all at once, which was somehow louder than noise. He picked up his bucket and walked toward it. The servants' entrance was a narrow side door used by staff coming in from the supply yard. It had a low ceiling and a short corridor that opened into the main working hall where the cleaners and kitchen workers started their mornings. It was built for people, not for anything larger. Sirith had pushed her head through it anyway. She had gotten as far as her neck and shoulders before the door frame stopped her. The stone around the entrance had cracked slightly at the top. She did not seem to notice or care. Her great amber eyes were moving slowly around the working hall until they found what they were looking for. They found Tom. Every person in that hall had pressed back against the walls. 2 kitchen workers had stepped behind a large cabinet. A young man who swept the supply yard had dropped his broom and not picked it up again. Elder Marin was standing near the far door with her hands folded and an expression that suggested she had perhaps been expecting something like this. Tom walked forward. He stopped a few feet from Sirith and looked up at her. She was so large that even with only her head and shoulders through the doorway she filled the space completely. He could feel the warmth coming off her scales the same way he had felt it in the storage hall. Her eyes were calm today. Not the panicked dark amber of the night she had returned. Just steady and clear and fixed on him. She had something in her mouth. She lowered her head carefully and set it on the floor in front of Tom. It was a scale. A single scale larger than Tom's palm, smooth and deep green-black, the color of her own hide. It had been set on a length of simple cord, knotted carefully at both ends so it could be worn around a neck. The scale caught the morning light and shifted, the way her scales did when she moved, patterns of dark color moving through it like water. Tom looked at it. He crouched down slowly and picked it up. It was warm. Heavier than he expected. Smooth on one side and ridged on the other where it had once been attached. He turned it over in his hands. He heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind him. He turned slightly and saw a young scholar who worked in the sanctuary library, a thin man named Aldrich who spent most of his time with old texts and rarely came into the working halls. Aldrich had gone the color of old paper. His eyes were fixed on the scale in Tom's hands. "What is it?" Tom asked him quietly. Aldrich opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "That is a chess scale," he said. His voice came out very careful, the way a person speaks when they want to make sure every word is exactly right. "From the center of the chest. Dragons only remove those voluntarily. It is the strongest scale they carry." He paused. In dragon law, giving a chess scale on a cord means the receiver has been named a guardian of the giver's bloodline. Another pause. "It means you are family. Legally. Permanently. Across all dragon courts." The working hall was absolutely silent. Tom looked at the scale in his hands for a long moment. Then he looked up at Sirith. She looked back at him with those steady amber eyes and said nothing. She did not need to. Tom stood up. He looped the cord over his head and settled the scale against his chest. It sat there warm and solid, heavier than anything he usually carried. He looked up at Sirith one more time. "Thank you," he said simply. Then he reached down, picked up his mop and went back to work.